The rage of an angry mob is not something anyone would want to witness. The recent mob attack on Brazil's capital has caused a huge uproar. Why a huge number of angry people would move to attack the city's capital is probably the #1 question on your mind right now. This is why we'll give you the full details of what went down that day with Bolsonaro's group of angry supporters in today's video. Let's go. The inception. During the 2022 election held in October, Jair Bolsonaro lost to his opponent, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. Bolsonaro's supporters immediately took to laying several violent threats. Still, it just seemed to the public that they were empty threats, seeing as the supporters did nothing. But little did the public know. On the 1st of January 2023, Lula da Silva was inaugurated as the president of Brazil, and all hell was let loose. Thousands of Jair Bolsonaro's supporters angrily entered 3 of the most symbolic official buildings in Brazil's capital, violently attacking the Supreme Court, Brazil's Congress, and the presidential office, also known as Planalto Palace, on the 8th of January 2023, demanding that Lula da Silva be removed from office. The protest. The protesters called on other Bolsonaro supporters and gathered a large mob of people for the demonstration on Sunday. Within the twinkle of an eye, violence began, and the scene was a crazy one. Protesters forced their way into government buildings, looting several items, breaking windows, and overturning furniture while making a video of their acts. They engaged in a full protest, yelling out statements about the election being false and rigged, while acting on the conspiracy theories previously made by Bolsonaro and his right-wing allies. The protesters were also covered in Brazil's yellow and green flag color, setting places ablaze, knocking down police officers, and filming the entire protest process. During the demonstration, protesters were heard saying, "Congress is ours, we are in power. We always said we would not give up." And so many declarations displaying their rage while filming it all. For a long time, the members of the public, especially Bolsonaro supporters, had been demanding military intervention to prevent the newly elected president, Lula da Silva, from ascending to office on the 1st of January 2023. Many were convinced that Lula could have never won the October election if it wasn't rigged. They were all demanding that Lula da Silva leave the presidential office, as his win was falsely claiming that he won in a stolen election. But you should know that someone incited the false claims made by Bolsonaro's supporters, and that person is none other than their leader, Jair Bolsonaro. For so many years, Bolsonaro has always spread rumors that Brazil's election systems were rigged with fraud and that the nation's elites were conspiring to eject him from power, all without any proof, if we must add. Lula da Silva and Bolsonaro's reactions. Lula da Silva said on Sunday, the 8th of January, that those false claims were the main cause of the attack on the country's capital. He said while addressing the nation that Bolsonaro triggered this. Lula da Silva added that he spurred attacks on the 3 powers whenever he could. This is also his responsibility. We can only assume that it was because of this that Jair Bolsonaro came out later that night to criticize the protests on Twitter. His tweets explained that his take on those peaceful demonstrations is legal and a part of democracy. But he further said that destruction and invasions of public buildings, like what occurred today, are out of character and not a part of democracy, heavily criticizing the actions of his supporters. He also clearly stated that Lula da Silva's accusations were wrong and without proof. You see, Jair Bolsonaro was initially in Florida, where he planned to stay for a few months during the early times of the protest. On the final days of his presidency, he flew out to Orlando to escape the investigation of his activities as president. Several people suspect Bolsonaro's involvement in the protest, as he had never unequivocally accepted defeat in the October election. He also never attended the new president's inauguration ceremony, where he was supposed to pass the presidential sash to Lula da Silva, a significant symbol of the transition of power for a country that lived under a 21-year military dictatorship until 1985. Instead, he sent his aides to attend the event and also handle the transition of power process, which he should have done in person. After the election, Bolsonaro said he fully supported peaceful protests, inspired by feelings of injustice in the electoral process. But right before he flew to Florida, Bolsonaro told his supporters to move on, saying, "We live in a democracy or we don't. No one wants an adventure," he further said. So the next day, Bolsonaro's supporters went out, fully intending to take charge and prevent Lula da Silva from staying in the presidential office. The protests initiated by Bolsonaro's people seemed like a targeted act directed at the current president Lula da Silva. During his inauguration, Lula made it clear that he plans on uniting Brazil, Latin America's largest country and one of the world's biggest democracies. According to Mr. President, this would be the main goal of his administration, as he is dedicated to achieving this goal. The invasion of Brazil's capital, which consists of the three main and strongest offices in the country, suggests that the country has so much division rooted in its system and its people than anyone could have imagined. This has only made things harder for the newly sworn-in president just 1 week into his administration. The introduction of the armed forces and higher-ups. Soon enough, these raging protesters could not be held back, and the armed forces had to be brought in to cool off the situation and reduce the damage the protesters had made. But the crowds pushed forward and shouted that they would not be stopped. One protester said, "Police are cowardly, trying to expel the people from Congress, but there is no way because even more are arriving." Seeing as they were outnumbered, police officers fired rubber bullets, tear gas canisters, and also pepper spray, gaining some help from 2 helicopters overhead that were shooting the same items from above. President Lula, who was not in Brazil during the invasion, issued an emergency decree until the 31st of January. This decree allows the federal government to take any measures necessary while trying to restore peace in the country's capital. He also stated that there is no precedent for what these people have done, and for that, these people must be punished. Upon his arrival at the protest scene later that Sunday to inspect the damage done, the president mentioned that he would ensure that his government thoroughly investigates anyone who may have secretly financed the protests. Several governments in Latin America and beyond were not left out of all this commotion. They were quick to condemn the protests in Brazil's capital. President Alberto Fernandez of Argentina wrote on Twitter, "Democracy is the only political system that guarantees freedoms and obliges us to respect the popular verdict." The president of Uruguay, Luis Lacalle Pou, also tweeted, "We regret and condemn the actions carried out in Brazil that threatens democracy and institutions." European leaders showed their full support toward President Lula da Silva. The president of France, Emmanuel Macron, said, "The will of the Brazilian people and democratic institutions must be respected." On Twitter, President Macron tweeted that President Lula da Silva could count on France's unfailing support. On his visit to the southern U.S. border, President Joe Biden called the protest outrageous. At the same time, his national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, said that the United States condemns any effort to undermine democracy in Brazil. Sullivan further tweeted, "Brazil's democracy will not be shaken by violence." Eventually, soldiers from the Brazilian army were called upon and they helped restore control of some of the buildings. Several soldiers from the army tactically approached the buildings through the back door. They ambushed the rioters who were already stealing the expensive art and ancient gems inside the buildings. In a few minutes, the rioters were escorted out of the buildings by the army and other law enforcement officers who were there to help. By nighttime, more than 7 hours after the riots and invasions began, the Minister of Justice of Brazil, Flávio Dino, said that the buildings had been cleared of trespassers and rioters. He further announced that the armed forces had arrested less than 200 people, which later totaled more than 400 rioters. Well, we've come to the end of today's video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel to get more great content like this.